If you're someone who's interested in Australia's military escapades overseas, you're about to hear how one of Australia's most legendary covert operations, Operation Jaywick in Singapore, hides a pretty sad story or a brutal story of what happened after they left. Tom Trumbull is an author and historian. He's written a new book called Survival in Singapore. Tom, what's Operation Jaywick? I'm not sure that I've sort of read about it in history books, but I'm not a close follower of military history. Tell me briefly what it was.
So the abridged version, Steve, is that Jaywick was a joint British-Australian commando operation that involved 14 operatives that used a commandeered Japanese fishing boat that was called the Krait. And they took that boat deep into Japanese territory at a time where the Empire of Japan laid claim to one of the largest territorial empires in human history. And they took it into Japanese-controlled waters, the hope being that the Japanese fishing boat would go undetected or would be ignored by air reconnaissance and Japanese patrol boats, which was the case. Anyway, they took it up through the Lombok Strait and then headed towards Singapore. And about 30 nautical miles south of Singapore, they dropped off 6 commandos who, in 3 two-man kayaks called foal boats, made their way up from this island and island hopped over 3 consecutive nights, set up a base at a place called Dongus Island, which is adjacent to Singapore Harbour. And then on September 26, 1943, went in under cover of darkness and attached limpet mines to 7 vessels, set them on a time-fused device, and then got out of there. On dawn at the following day, the mines detonated, and what we know for sure is that 6 of those 7 boats were either destroyed or seriously damaged, and the kayakers, or the commandos, made it back to the rendezvous point with the Krait, and then made it back to Australia, to Exmouth Gulf, which is where they'd set off a couple of months earlier in Western Australia, and would ultimately be fated as great heroes. But my interest in this story, Steve, as you said in the intro, was what really happened next.
So what I'm reading that as a great success for the Australian commandos at that time, Tom.
It was, and it's not to be belittled by any stretch of the imagination. It's no small thing to sink a vessel, and from a tactical perspective, it's
undetected.
Yeah, correct. And these were big boats. These were 10 to 20,000 ton vessels. They were, oil tankers and transport vessels and freighters and so forth. And from that tactical perspective, it certainly was a success. There's no question about that. But what has been less, I suppose, acknowledged or known about, certainly in Australia, is the aftermath of Jaywick.
What was the aftermath of Jaywick? It was successful. They sunk at least 6 out of 7 vessels, and they got back home to Exmouth and WA.
So the aftermath, to begin with, at this point in time, there was an investigation going on in Singapore carried out by the Japanese military police, the dreaded Kempai Thai, who were a brutal outfit. And they were looking at a rise in criminality and a little bit of low-level sabotage, which included cutting of wires, there was a factory fire, that sort of thing. And they concluded that there was a very well-organised insurgency or a fifth column that was operating within, which was wrong. There wasn't. And the uptick in criminality was really a function of what was quite a oppressive regime. But nonetheless, Operation Jaywick, this attack on Singapore Harbour, happens right smack bang in the middle of this investigation. And because the Australian military didn't take responsibility for the attack because they wanted to repeat the success of it, and so they wanted to keep it quiet, the Japanese concluded incorrectly that the attack was in fact carried out by an insurgency that was operating out of the Chinese community in Singapore in league with British internees in Changi prison. And it precipitated a raid on Changi prison where 57 internees were arrested, brutally tortured. 15 of them would die. And we don't know the numbers, unfortunately, Steve, but, I would estimate hundreds of Chinese were arrested as part of that investigation, and many scores would also be killed in what was really a brutal atrocity.
Why did the Japanese police think they had done this when they were in an internment camp, in basically a prisoner of war camp of sorts? Why did they suspect them when they were under lock and key?
That's the sort of million-dollar question, and it has to do with a kind of a psychological phenomenon called, fifth column fever, which was essentially paranoia. The Japanese at this point in time were feeling like they were losing control of occupied Singapore. In 1943, the war for Japan is starting to experience its most significant reversal since their campaign had begun. And so all of these things give rise to this view, well, this could only have been carried out by an insurgency from within, remembering that commando, operations or covert operations of this nature were entirely new. This was a new military capability, and it really came to the fore in the Second World War, and the Japanese hadn't developed anything of the sort. And so they concluded, as I said erroneously, that it had come from within, and then they started to draw dots together and came up with a 1 + 1 = 3 equation ultimately, and it was sort of a ludicrous conclusion, but they had all of the evidence retrofit, I suppose, their theory.
My guest is Tom Trumbull. Tom is an author and historian. He's written a new book called Survival in Singapore. As you're picking up, I hope it's a pretty ripping yarn about Operation Jaywick. So this was a special forces operation. It was successful. Why shouldn't the Australian authorities keep it quiet rather than claim, the acknowledgement for undertaking the operation? If they wanted to do more, they had a pretty significant enemy, Tom. Do you think it was inappropriate for the Australian authorities not to say, we undertook that operation?
I don't think I'd say inappropriate. I think that the original purpose of the mission, and this is important to keep in mind, was strategically they were going to take responsibility for the operation. The point there being it was going to be a propaganda mission. It was a message that they wanted to send to the Japanese to say, look what we've done. We've created this new military capability. We can infiltrate your most heavily defended seaports deep within your controlled territories. Who's to say we can't get into the Bay of Tokyo? And it was hoped that that would give rise to a kind of a realignment of Japan's defensive position. In short, that they roll back forces and resources from the front lines, and it would contract Japan's area of influence as the Allies clawed back territory. But because of the unprecedented success, I suppose, it was a victim in a way of its own success. Okay. The fact that the Japanese felt that the operation had happened from within or been planned and executed from within, the Australian military thought, well, hang on a minute, we can do this again because they're not going to know it's us. The important point here is that the Australian military knew that the Chinese particularly and the British internees were being rounded up, and they still kept quiet. And I think that is the nature of these sorts of commando operations, that invariably there is collateral damage. I don't take anything away from Operation Jaywick. It was a by-the-book, brilliant operation, and it was resourceful. It was a demonstration of incredible gallantry and courage. But I think commando operations as a whole, you have to weigh, did this seriously hamper Japan's capacity to wage war, weighed against the impact of the innocent people in Singapore.
Who are Elizabeth Choi and Robert Heatley Scott, Tom?
So Elizabeth Choi is a remarkable woman. School teacher. She was born in Borneo. She was sent to Singapore where she got an education and where she would ultimately raise her 4 younger siblings on her own. She became a school teacher of such renown that she was recruited to a prestigious school called St Andrews College, which is still there in Singapore to this day, and then was all set for a glittering career in education until the war came. And then because she was Chinese, she, like so many others, was sort of identified as persona non grata. And the only job that she could get was as a canteen operator at a hospital. And it was in that role where she becomes this really important functionary in a very sophisticated smuggling operation, which led to 400,000 Singaporean dollars getting into Changi prison, which was crucial because it enabled a black market to thrive, which meant the internees could beef up their meagre rations with food that they could purchase off the black market. But it came, Steve, at a huge personal cost because the Japanese concluded that money was being used to fund the operation to attack Singapore Harbour. So that's Elizabeth Choi.
Right. Robert Heatley Scott?
He's a historian's dream. The reason for that is because, well, he's a man that's gone undetected, and he was a brilliant diplomat. He was very senior within the British administration of Singapore, and in the war crimes tribunals that happened in Singapore after the war directly related to this atrocity, he was the key witness for the prosecution. But the stenographer misspelt his name as Robert Heatley Scott, and as a consequence of that, Robert Heatley Scott has been largely unknown because historians just thought he was some faceless bureaucrat. In fact, he was very senior, and his family, to my great relief, eternal gratitude, donated his personal papers to the National Library of Scotland, which included a 100-page A3 typeset description of his war experience, which became the kind of backbone of this book. He gave incredible insight. It's a wonderful social document. He had a novelist's eye for detail, and he documented his experiences, and he was a brilliant man.
What impressions are you hoping might stay with the reader when they read Survival in Singapore, Tom?
Well, I think it's two things, Steve. I would like, the Australians to keep Operation Jaywick in mind, because it is a really remarkable thing, and I make no judgments about that. I want to make that clear. I think it was a brilliant operation, and it's something for which Australians should be proud. It was elegant. It was brave. It was superb. That said, as I said earlier, I think it does give us an opportunity to weigh the cost of these commando operations and the inevitability of the grey area where we stray into sort of ethical uncertainty. Was it worth it? Did it achieve its aims beyond just sinking 6 ships, which, like I said, is no mean feat?
Yep.
But, asking those sorts of questions, that's my hope, and I hope it does pay credit to two remarkable individuals in Elizabeth Choi and Robert Heatley-Scott as well.
Tom, thanks for telling the story.
Thanks, Steve.
Tom Trumbull, author and historian. The book is called Survival in Singapore. This is ABC Radio Brisbane. ABC News not far away.